Hello again, 122. In this video, I will go over the first two questions in Chapter 22 on East Asia, on China and Japan from 1793 through 1911. We will do the finish of the second part of the 19th century in Part 2. And we will discuss basically the first question of what the British motives in China were and how the Chinese responded. And then we'll see some of the internal problems that developed. And we will finish this question too, how the Qin or Manchu dynasty finally collapsed in the early 20th century in 1911. This is a nice picture of the Lord Macartney's mission in 1793 to China, and it failed. The flags that were shown in that picture proclaimed that the ambassador bearing tribute from the country of England had arrived, but the tribute was in vain for Macartney's request for an increase in trade. This is the British goal. They want to increase trade for some serious reasons, as we'll see in a few moments. And it's flatly rejected. He left Beijing with nothing to show for his efforts. In fact, the Chinese Emperor Qianlong responded to his visitor's requests with a polite but poorly disguised condescension. To Macartney's proposal that a British ambassador be stationed in Beijing, the emperor replied that such a request was not in harmony with the state system of our dynasty and will definitely not be permitted. He also rejected the British envoy's suggestion that regular trade relations be established between the two countries. We receive all sorts of precious things as gifts from the myriad nations, replied the Celestial Empire. Consequently, he added, there is nothing we lack, as your principal envoy and others themselves have observed. We have never set much store on such strange and ingenious objects, nor do we need more of your country's manufactures. So that is the Chinese response. They reject it. They see no need for anything from the West or the barbarians. And when British demands for the right to carry out trade and missionary activities in China were rejected, Britain resorted to force, and in the Opium War, which we'll talk about in a moment, broke out. This gave the Manchu troops a sound thrashing. And finally, China was forced to open its doors. So it leads into the second question. We'll partially answer it in this video and we'll finish it up in part 2. How did it ultimately collapse and what role did the Western powers play in this process? In 1800, the Qin dynasty was at the height of its power. China had experienced a long period of peace and prosperity, a few hundred years, under the rule of the two great emperors Kangxi and Qianlong. Its borders were secure, and its culture and intellectual achievements were the envy of the world. And these are two overarching reasons why this dynasty collapsed. Pressure by the Western powers, but in recent years, they have said that internal changes have played a major role in the dynasty's collapse, and at least some of its problems during the 19th century were self-inflicted. So, imperial pressure and internal changes are two overarching reasons for the decline of the Qin or the Manchu dynasty. Both explanations have some validity. Like so many of its predecessors, after an extended period of growth, the Qin dynasty began to suffer from the familiar dynastic ills that had told the tale of Chinese history of official corruption, peasant unrest, and incompetence at court. Such weaknesses were probably exacerbated, made worse, by the rapid growth in population. And then if there's a few bad harvests and people don't have enough food, they revolt, and then the dynasties decline because the people feel that the mandate of heaven has been lost. They have not taken care of the people in charge, and they have a right then to replace them. By 1800, Westerners had been in contact with China for more than 200 years, but Western traders were limited to a small commercial outlet at Canton. This arrangement was not acceptable to the British, however. Not only did they chafe at being restricted to a tiny enclave, But the growing British appetite for Chinese tea created a severe balance of payments problem, ladies and gentlemen. The Brits are addicted to Chinese tea. So what are they going to do about this? Too much silver is flowing from Britain into Chinese coffers, enriching them. The British solution was opium, which was grown in northeastern India, which could then be transported on ships from India through the Strait of Malacca into China proper. And then they've already been growing this in southwestern China for several hundred years, but it had been used primarily for medicinal purposes. Now, as imports increased, popular demand for the addictive product in southern China became insatiable, despite an official prohibition on its use. Soon, bullion was flowing out of the Chinese imperial treasury into the pockets of British merchants. The largest drug empire ever, the British East India Company, drug empire, ladies and gentlemen. The Chinese became concerned and they tried to negotiate. In 1839, Lin Dezhou, a Chinese official appointed to curtail the opium trade, appealed to Queen Victoria. And you can read this entire letter, if you want, in the 7th edition on page 530 or 573. Moral principles paled before the lure of commercial profits, and the British continued to promote the opium trade, arguing that if the Chinese did not want the opium, they don't have to buy it. Free trade, right? Neoliberalism. Zhou attacked on 3 fronts. He imposed penalties on smokers, he arrested dealers, and he seized supplies from the importers. And this caused his downfall, because he is now taking British property. And the British government, claiming it could not permit British subjects to be exposed to insult and injustice, launched a naval expedition to punish the Manchus and to force them to open China to foreign trade. And that little footnote, if you're interested in further reading on China, for a good general overview of the modern Chinese history, see I.C.Y. Zhu, HSU, The Rise of Modern China, 6th edition, that's from the Oxford Press in 2000, or C.J. Spence's Stimulating the Search for Modern China, New York Press from 1990. Here is the Qin dynasty at its height. The red line indicates the extent of its sphere of influence. This is from about 1775, the 3/4 mark of the 18th century. This is how far their influence extends. The green are the sometimes tributary states. Basically, Southeast Asia would pay tribute to China to keep their semi-independence. What has changed on this map from one in previous Chinese history? At this particular time in 1775, Korea is no longer a tribute state. And this little bluish type line indicates where the country will fall back to by the time of the collapse in 1911. The Opium War from 1839 through 1842 demonstrated the superiority of British firepower and military tactics. And this is a nice lithograph that shows that these vessels, which are the same vessels which in 1450 are some of the most advanced sailing vessels of the time, they're still using them in China. Whereas now modern sailing vessels with steam power, that's what this paddle wheeler, you can see that out there, have been developed by the British. They also have superior firepower, and they just devastated the old Chinese junks that Chenghua had used to possibly circumnavigate the globe back almost 100 years before the time of Columbus. And finally, the Qin agreed to terms, and in this Treaty of Nanjing, they agreed to open 5 more ports, they limited tariffs on imported British goods, and they granted extraterritoriality to British citizens or diplomats, right? They're not going to be tried by Chinese law, but by British law. And to pay a substantial indemnity to cover the costs of the war. Wow, one-sided treaty. They also agreed to cede Hong Kong, which was dismissed at the time as a barren rock, to Britain, and a later treaty will secure a lease that will secure Hong Kong as being the base of British operations in the Far East until the very late 20th century, when the lease ran out and mainland China finally regains control of Hong Kong. Nothing was said about the opium trade. That will be dealt with in a later series of treaties, although it's going to be a habit of the Chinese until the early 20th century. Although a few concerned Chinese argue that the court should learn more about European civilization, once again, that court is not listening. He contended China had nothing to learn from the barbarians and that borrowing foreign ways would only undercut the purity of the Confucian civilization. Now here's a big internal problem. The Qin failed to deal with internal economic problems, and that led to a major peasant revolt that shook the foundations of the empire. The Taiping Rebellion owed something to the Western incursion because the leader of the uprising, Hong Xiangshan, was a failed civil service examination candidate, and he was a Christian convert who viewed himself as the younger brother of Jesus, and he hoped to establish what he referred to as a heavenly kingdom of supreme peace. But there were many local causes as well. The rapid increase in population forced millions to eke out a living as sharecroppers or landless laborers, and official corruption and incompetence led to the whipsaw of increased taxes, a decline in government services. Even the Grand Canal was allowed to silt up, hindering the shipment of grain. And in 1853, the rebels seized Nanjing, and this area will be the height of the rebellion's success. Then it's plagued by factionalism. And the rebellion gradually lost momentum, and it was finally suppressed in 1864, but 25 million people had been killed, the vast majority of them civilians, and this is a big, big beginning of the downfall of the Qin dynasty. And we will continue with the fall up to 1911, when it finally collapses for good, in part 2.